Ukraine Minister of Defense now admits their soldiers are being slaughtered for the sake of NATO's mission, not Ukraine's mission, but NATO's mission. Listen.
Сьогодні в своїх промовах мої візаві, міністр оборони, чітко кажуть: Олексій, ми розуміємо, що ви бороните сьогодні весь цивілізаційний світ, весь Захід. Ви є реальним щитом цивілізації. Ми виконуємо місію НАТО сьогодні. Без втрати їхньої крові, з втратою нашої крові. Тому для них треба витрачати їх зброю.
And I don't recall hearing this before, actually, from the Ukrainian side. Joining us now is Colonel Douglas McGregor to find out about the state of this war and all of these moving pieces. Colonel, I don't recall, maybe you do, Ukraine speaking about NATO in these terms before. Let's take that first. That defense minister comments there is pretty eye-opening to me.
Well, I suppose it's eye-opening, but I see even larger dynamics occurring inside Ukraine itself. There are large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers who are suffering from tuberculosis. It's reached epidemic dimensions. And These soldiers are being shipped around the battlefield without regard to the fact that they're infectious, causing this tuberculosis epidemic to spread very rapidly. Secondly, the medical support for the Ukrainian soldiers is not very good. That's not the fault of Ukrainian doctors and nurses. It's simply a fact that they're overwhelmed with wounded, overwhelmed with the requirement to move these people away from the battlefield. And then finally, you have large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers who are being forced into uniform, sent to the front with relatively little training. They don't have trained officers and non-commissioned officers. And the reports that we hear repeatedly are that they go forward, they take heavy fire, they find that they've been abandoned by any NCOs or officers that were given to them, and then they're essentially chopped into meat by the Russians. Some of them are giving up. Some of them are just leaving the battlefield if they can get away, but of course then they have to deal with the Ukrainian secret police, which rounds them up and executes them. So it's a pretty frightening situation, and I think what this minister of Defense is trying to do is to put some distance between this disaster and the people in Kiev by saying, look, it's not really our fault. We're doing what NATO and Washington tell us to. Well, I think that's true to some extent, but they have been gleefully sending thousands of Ukrainians into the meat grinder for months now. And these relentless attacks that never made any sense down south. Right. That have left them really bereft of manpower. So I would not be surprised in the near future if we do not hear about Ukrainian soldiers marching towards Kiev to deal decisively with this regime. I really think that's in the future.
So soldiers, disaffected soldiers, saying enough is enough, going to Kiev and saying, where's Zelensky? Where's this leadership? We've had enough of it. Now, I want you to clarify that, because I've played videos of Ukrainian soldiers pointing out that they are chastising their leadership, talking about how they have no food, they have no weapons. And when we play these clips, we get hundreds of people that say, thank you for sharing the truth about what's happening there. And then inevitably, you get the few that say, this is all fake. This is fake news. You're a Russian puppet for showing what Ukrainian soldiers are saying about their leadership. But this is actually happening, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. Without question. I would compare the situation to the Tsarist army in 1917. I mean, the Russian forces, and they were not all Russians at that point, Ukrainians, Russians, all sorts of people from all over then the Tsarist empire. They were dying by the boatload fighting the Germans. And if you go back and look at World War I, the Germans were totally different from the Germans of the Second War. They had no interest in invading the Soviet Union or invading Russia. And so what they did is they set up defenses on the eastern borders of Poland and the Baltic littoral. And then the Tsarist army simply expended its resources, human and otherwise, against German defenses with plentiful artillery and machine guns, mines and wire. And finally, the Tsarist army said, we've lost 1.5 million dead. We can't go on like this anymore. And there was no response. The Tsar should have said enough's enough, ended it, and led his army home. He'd still be in business if he had, but he didn't do that. And so you get the revolution. I think this is where the Ukrainians are headed, unless there's peace. And I think they know that. I think a bunch in Kiev is worried about it. There's no doubt in my mind. And if you go to Kherson, this area that was evacuated, The Ukrainian secret police has set up quite a network there and is running around punishing people left and right for speaking Russian. I mean, imagine sending American police into Arizona or New Mexico and punishing someone who speaks Spanish. It's absurd. Well, this is what's been going on. And very, very deliberately, the Russians have targeted SBU headquarters, Ukrainian secret police headquarters in Kherson, with the goal of essentially killing them and knocking them out of business. This whole house of cards in Ukraine will collapse. It's going to collapse sooner than I think Washington realizes.
And yet Washington, as we said in the intro, continues to funnel weapons. You heard President Biden with a new tranche of weapons, mentioning, of course, these new Bradley fighting vehicles. Now, I am not a steeped military man like yourself, but from what I understand of these vehicles, a lot of them had been mothballed for years. We have about 3,800 of them in the United States. There's about 2,500 or 2,800 of them that had been mothballed. They had been retrofitted for the wars in Iraq, in the desert. So they can shoot their anti-aircraft retrofitted and their infantry, so you can put infantry in them as well. Every time we hear about one of these new vehicles being shipped to Ukraine, it's always, and I read the Twitter comments from people, they're like, hallelujah, this is going to turn the tide of the war. This new vehicle will make a change. What do you say about this new tranche of weapons?
Many armies have been through the experience of betting heavily on the arrival of something new to turn things around. It never happens, because warfare is a product of a multitude of factors and various sets of equipment and various kinds of formations. The Bradley right now, the ones that we're likely sending are not necessarily the most up-to-date and modern model by any stretch of the imagination. And the Bradley, while it was adequate in 1991 for the war that we fought, is not a particularly impressive vehicle. The original Bradleys had the fuel essentially underneath the feet of the soldiers riding in the Bradley. And the Bradley was essentially a combination of iron, steel, and aluminum. And they had a bad habit of catching fire. We lost a Bradley in my unit in 1991 because a tow missile that was in the hammer, you had this thing that rises up and then fires the tow missile from the side of the track. That's your anti-tank weapon, if you will. And that exploded because it was struck by a 30 millimeter round from a BMP. The blast went into the Bradley, and the tow missiles that were inside the Bradley then exploded. We had a man killed outright, and then 3 others who were wounded. There were only 4 people at the time on the track, fortunately. We were able to get the other 3 out. They were wounded, obviously, but eventually returned to duty. And the thing burnt furiously for hours. The next morning, it looked like a 113. The turret had literally sunken down into the body of the Bradley. Now, the newest variants that they've been producing are designed differently. They've moved the fuel out of the way. They've changed some of the alloys that are being used. But the point is, this is not a wonder weapon, and it's not easily maintained. You're talking about a 25 millimeter chain gun, which was originally designed for use on helicopters. We had to send people to school for years to master these things. They come back, and in turn, they train soldiers. And it's not something that you do quickly. And I don't know how much experience any of these Ukrainian soldiers will have had with this kind of machinery. I doubt very much. And we haven't even talked about how do you maintain these things, because everything breaks down. It doesn't matter how good it is. And then how do you repair it and get it back into service? So the bottom line is that I don't expect very many of these Bradleys to show up. Whenever they show up, they're not going to be immediately useful. And this is the problem with everything on that list. Everything we want to send or push into them demands time. Time to train people to use it properly, time to maintain it, time to refit it and send it into action and then keep it running. This is not an easy proposition for the Ukrainians. It would have been much easier if all of this material had been sent in March and April, because then you would have had some time to work on it. At that point, of course, the Russians were not at war with Ukraine. They were engaged in what they thought would be a punitive action to induce negotiations. It took them 3 or 4 months to figure out that wasn't going to happen. Now they are at war with Ukraine. Everything's changed. So the time, the opportunity to make any of this material work in any reasonable or meaningful way is over.
stark. And we have the United States now, and according to a report, and I'll get you out of here on this, Colonel, which is that the United States is now going to be training Ukrainians in Oklahoma on, I think if I'm not mistaken, the Patriot missile system, which we've talked about before here on the show, is largely doesn't even really work. And so we're now bringing Ukrainians into the United States to be trained on these systems and then head back to the battlefield. What do you make of this?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't sign on for the notion that it doesn't work.
Okay.
I think it does work. How well is another question that I can't evaluate. But Raytheon produces excellent material, excellent missiles, first-class systems, radars, and so forth. So I wouldn't short shrift Raytheon.
So let me be clear then. What I've been hearing is that you need a lot of them for them to be really effective.
Oh, yeah.
So you need to blanket an area in them. Yeah.
Yeah, when we talked the last time, I said you'd need 10 battalions.
Right.
Okay, so 10 times what, 240 launchers? 10 times 24 launchers in every battalion. That's 240 launchers. That's thousands and thousands of missiles plus radars. And this is something that's very fragile. You can't move it quickly. Now, to go back to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the Ukrainians that are going over there are going to get at least 3 months of very serious in-school training. That's fine. That's not enough. You need several months of experience, hands-on experience in the field within organizations of trained people that include officers and non-commissioned officers know what they are doing. My view is this: the probability of the Ukrainians being ready to employ this stuff on their own is very low. I think what we'll try to do is man it largely with Ukrainians, but then put NATO officers and NCOs from the United States, Germany, Great Britain, who have these same launchers, into Western Ukraine. They will then be used for point defense of whatever they deem to be important. They cannot protect the whole area, but they can provide adequate point defense, bridge, airports, factories, command centers, so forth. But when will this happen? Not quickly. Again, all of this takes time. What's coming next are these Russian offensives. And I think with the recent changes in the Russian command structure, moving Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, in to be the overall commander in Ukraine to ensure that Surovikin, who is still running the daily show, has everything that he wants and everything he needs, suggests to me that when they come, they're going to come soon within the next 3 or 4 weeks, because the ground is now largely frozen. It's going to be a crushing blow. And the Ukrainians themselves had admitted in this last interview, Zaluzhny and even Zelensky admitted what's coming is something we're going to have a lot of trouble surviving. They did everything but say, look, we're going to be crushed. And then they said, you've got to give us all this stuff. The problem with giving everything is too late. It's not going to change anything. But here's the good news inside Washington. The wealth transfer continues. In other words, the money that is moved over to DOD and then into the defense industrial complex and then to donors and interested parties that buy up politicians on the Hill, all of that continues without interruption. That's very important for Washington.
So the machine continues. And all of this talk about pulling back on Ukraine aid, it doesn't seem likely. It doesn't seem likely the money's going to continue to flow. And we're going to continue to even build busts and statues inside of Washington, which is the next move. Colonel, thank you so much.
You have one more problem that needs to be addressed, and that is, how could we have miscalculated so badly? People at the top of the U.S. military establishment want nothing to do with this war in Ukraine. They have no objections to sending equipment and advisors, but they made it very clear they do not want this administration to commit any of our forces in Poland or Romania, let alone Polish and Romanian forces, to Western Ukraine. They're opposed to that. They understand that's something we can't do. We can't sustain it. We have 457,000 troops in the so-called active army. That's down from its real strength of 495. We can't recruit. We have only 74,000 men in the so-called ready reserves. So you're not talking about a large pool of replacements. And if we were to go into that environment and fight, you're talking about thousands of casualties, thousands of dead potentially. So the Pentagon knows that. The problem now is they bet heavily that the Ukrainians, based on that initial performance by the Russians, which they completely misinterpreted and didn't understand, they said, see, the Russians are weak. We can win this. That was always wrong. Now the problem is that we're going to have all these forces sitting there. Ukraine is going to collapse under the weight of the Russian offensives. And then people in Washington are going to say, we have to do something. We can't let this happen. We will have been shown as wrong. We will look like fools. We have to, quote unquote, do something. That's a very dangerous statement. And that's one that we've heard before over the last 50 years many times. We have to do something. Well, doing anything at this point in time would be very dangerous and very ill-advised. That's why I continue to warn that at the insistence of people in the White House, the State Department, and potentially on the Hill, the Department of Defense may be goaded into action that it would otherwise not want to take. And in every dispute since 1963 between the JCS and the president and his friends have always won the fight.